Today I'm going to tell you a story so cruel it silences a room set in the unforgiving heart of the old American West, where dust ruled lives and mercy was rare. It's a land where power decided fate, and a single mistake could bind two souls together forever. It all began with one small act, meant as a joke, one decision so heartless that it reshaped an entire frontier. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The laughter that filled Mortimer Blackmore's great hall cut like ice through dry winter air. It wasn't joyful. It was sharp, practiced, and merciless laughter shaped by power and cruelty, and every echo of it was aimed at his daughter. Iris Blackmore stood before the raised seat of authority, her head lowered not in respect, but to keep the firelight from exposing the deep red mark that stained the left side of her face, stretching from temple to jaw like an unhealed wound. To the gathered elites, that mark was a sign of ruin, a blemish they whispered about, a so-called curse, that made her unfit for marriage, unworthy of mercy. Tonight her father meant to finish the humiliation. Standing a short distance away was a stranger, Wade Kestrel, the outsider rancher, who had purchased a useless spread of rock and dust along the western edge of Blackmore land. He was a broad-shouldered man built hard by years of isolation. Old scars crossed his face like faded maps, and his eyes carried the gray weight of distant storms. He lived apart by choice, spoke with a rough frontier cadence, and kept closer company with horses than people. To the court, he was little more than an animal wearing a man's shape. As payment for the land taxes you somehow managed to scrape together, Mortimer Blackmore declared, his voice thick with mock generosity, "I grant you a gift." He gestured toward Iris, the motion careless, dismissive, like tossing away something broken. "A wife! As you can plainly see, she is flawed." A wave of laughter surged through the hall. "But she carries noble blood," Mortimer continued. "She'll add character to your lonely claim." The room erupted again. The spectacle was complete, the cursed daughter bound to the foreign brute. A fitting ending, they thought. Iris's hands trembled inside her sleeves. She had learned early that tears only sharpened cruelty. She felt Wade Kestrel's gaze settle on her, steady, unreadable. She braced for the familiar disgust, the sickening pity that always came first. But he said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward. His worn leather boot made no sound against the polished stone floor. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she caught the scent of pine sap and earth clinging to his coat. Then slowly he lowered himself, not in obedience, but so their eyes were level. Up close, his gaze wasn't harsh. It was deep, quiet. For the first time in her life, Iris found herself unseen as a defect. He extended one large, calloused hand. The gesture was plain, honest, entirely out of place in a room built on deception. After years of shrinking from touch, Iris lifted her hand and placed it in his. Her fingers shook. His grip was firm, careful, steady as bedrock. The promise in it had no name. The journey west passed in silence. Iris rode behind Wade on a broad-backed horse, her hands gripping the coarse wool of his coat, her cheek resting against the solid line of his back. Behind them, the stone halls of her childhood faded into distance, replaced by rolling scrubland and endless sky. With every mile, the world grew quieter. The air smelled of sagebrush and dust. When they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking low, staining the hills in amber and violet. There was no grand house waiting, only a compact stone cabin, weather-darkened wood, a modest barn, and a corral holding a few patient horses. They ate without speaking, the fire popping softly while the wind whispered against the walls. He never urged her to talk. He never lingered on the mark on her face. When their eyes met, it was brief, respectful, before he looked away. When she finished, he took her bowl, rinsed it clean, then settled onto the furs with his back turned, giving her privacy without being asked. Iris lay on the narrow bed, the quilt rough beneath her fingers, listening to the slow, even rhythm of his breathing blend with the crackle of flames. For the first time she could remember there was no laughter aimed at her, no hushed voices behind raised hands. The quiet was not hollow. It carried weight, a steady sense of dignity. In this lonely stretch of land beside this scarred and wordless man, the shame she had carried like a second skin finally began to loosen. The days slipped into a gentle pattern. Wade rose before dawn to tend his stock, and Iris woke to the scent of wood smoke and steeping tea. He never demanded her presence or her labor. He left food on the table and went about his work. Slowly, cautiously, Iris began to shape the cabin into something lived in. She scrubbed the stone floor until it caught the light-stitched worn seams in his coat, using thread pulled from her once fine dress, and learned the quiet rules of the hearth, how to keep a fire alive without forcing it. There was comfort in the small tasks. One afternoon, repairing a fence line near the house, she felt a sudden pull at her sleeve. A small jade button, carved and delicate, had torn free and dropped into the dust. She searched until her fingers ached, but it was gone, swallowed by the earth along with the last fragile piece of her former life. The loss stung not for the palace but for the memory of Agnes Hollow, the only soul in her father's household who had ever treated her kindly. Iris said nothing. Days later, the button appeared beside her morning cup. It had been washed clean, polished until the green stone gleamed. Wade stood outside, brushing down a horse, his back turned, but she understood. He had noticed her distress, searched after she had stopped, and returned it without a word. She held it in her palm, its cool surface steadying her. It was no longer just a button. It was an answer. I see you. I see what you lose. Their bond grew in small, wordless ways. He left a single tough wildflower on the sill. She made sure his water skin was full before sunrise. He spoke more not with stories, but with brief remarks about the land, the sky, the animals. He named the horses Flint, Mire, and Brim. He showed her how to brush them until their coats shone his large hands, guiding hers with surprising care. She learned that the hardness in his face came not from cruelty, but from years endured. The mark on her face, the thing that had defined her life, seemed invisible to him. He noticed her eyes, her hands, the quiet way she moved. He saw her. One night, a sudden storm broke over the hills. A violent gust tore the door open, snuffing out the lamp and throwing the cabin into darkness. Iris gasped, the old terror clawing up from somewhere deep inside her fear of the dark carved into her bones by years of being locked away as punishment. Just as panic threatened to take hold, she sensed him beside her. Wade Kestrel's presence was solid, steady like a wall set against the storm. He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her. His voice alone cut through the chaos, low and sure. I'm here. You're safe. And in that moment, she believed him. The fragile calm they had built shattered with the sound of hooves. 3 riders appeared out of the dusk. They weren't wanderers who'd lost their way. They rode like men paid to intimidate, posture-loose movements, confident eyes, sharp and hungry. Their clothes were travel-worn, but well-kept. They pulled their horses up hard in front of the cabin. The leader slid down first, a crooked scar splitting his upper lip into a permanent sneer. Kestrel, he called, dragging out the name with contempt. Looks like your luck finally ran dry. Mortimer Blackmore sold off your debt to Harlan Vane. He spat into the dirt. This land belongs to Vane now. You've got until sundown to pack your junk and clear out. Wade stepped out of the barn, his face unreadable, hands empty, but loose at his sides. "This land's paid for," he said evenly, though something dangerous coiled beneath his calm. The man laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. "The tax was nothing. Real price is whatever the Baron decides." Then his eyes slid past Wade and locked onto Iris, frozen in the doorway. His grin widened. "Well, I'll be damned. Blackmore's little curse." He chuckled. "Heard all about you. Didn't figure you'd last a week out here." He took a step toward her, his gaze lingering too long on the red mark on her face. "Maybe we haul you off as partial payment," he said. "Baron likes rare pieces." Wade moved, not with the wild swing of a brute, but with the clean, lethal speed of a man who knew exactly how violence worked. He crossed the distance in 2 silent strides. The first rider barely had time to widen his eyes before Wade's fist slammed into his jaw with a bone-jarring crack. The other 2 reached for weapons, but Wade was already among them. He caught the second man by the leg and ripped him from the saddle, dropping him hard onto the packed earth. The third spurred his horse and drew steel, but Wade snatched up a broken fence post, gripping it as it groaned in his hands. He moved with a controlled savagery Iris had never imagined, precise, ruthless, unstoppable. This wasn't a rancher defending dirt. This was a man shaped by war. The fight ended almost as fast as it began. Wade tore the sword from the third rider's grip and sent both man and horse bolting into the hills. The other 2 lay groaning in the dust. Wade stood over them, chest rising and falling, something dark burning in his eyes. "Go back to Harlan Vane," he said, his voice rough as thunder. "Tell him this land isn't his." He leaned closer. "And if he ever sends anyone near her again, I'll return them in pieces." He kicked their weapons away and watched as they dragged themselves upright, hauled their leader back onto a horse, and fled in a haze of dust and fear. Only then did Wade turn toward Iris. Blood ran freely from a deep gash along his forearm. Their eyes met. She didn't see triumph there. She saw something heavier, pain quiet and familiar, as though the violence had torn at a life he'd fought hard to bury. Without a word, Iris tore a strip from the hem of her last silk chemise, the softness of the fabric painfully out of place. She guided Wade inside and pressed him down into a chair. He didn't resist. His body remained rigid, the aftermath of the fight still clinging to him. The cabin filled with a silence thick enough to choke on. Iris knelt before him, dipping the silk into a bowl of warm water she'd drawn from the hearth. As Iris Blackmore began washing the gash along Wade Kestrel's arm, his body tensed. It wasn't the sting of the wound that made him flinch. It was her touch. Heat radiated from his skin beneath her fingers. This was the first time she had ever laid hands on him, with intention, with closeness that carried meaning. Her hands, so often uncertain, did not shake. Everything else faded away, the cabin, the storm, the world, until there was only the wound, the slow tinting of water, red, the tight strength of muscle beneath her palm. She worked with quiet determination, driven by the need to repair more than torn flesh, to mend the violence that had ripped through the life they were just beginning to build. "You were a soldier," she said softly. It wasn't a question. The way he had moved, the ruthless precision, none of it belonged to a simple rancher. Wade studied her face. After a long pause, he nodded once. "Long time ago," he said. His voice sounded unused, roughened by memory. "A war I never chose, for a king I never believed in. I walked away from it. Or thought I had." She finished cleaning the cut, her touch gentler now, as she bound the wound with clean cloth. When her fingers brushed his, something passed between them, brief electric warmth cutting through the cold weight of the day. Iris lifted her eyes. For an instant, the walls he kept around himself cracked open. In his gaze, she saw deep solitude, a sorrow that mirrored her own. "Why did you protect me?" she asked. The words had been clawing at her since the moment he stepped between her and the riders. They mocked you. I've lived with that my whole life. No one's ever stood up for me. Slowly, Wade reached out with his uninjured hand, giving her time to pull back. She didn't. His fingers, rough scarred, traced the edge of the red mark on her cheek. There was no hesitation in the gesture, no disgust, no pity, only acceptance. They were throwing stones, he said quietly, his voice hard with conviction. And those stones were meant for you. His hand fell away, but the warmth lingered on her skin more real than any insult she had ever endured. Kneeling there with blood and rain thick in the air, Iris understood something shift inside her. She was no longer a burden passed along as a cruel joke. She was home. And this man, silent, scarred, unyielding, was her refuge. Harlan Vane was not the sort of man who accepted loss. When word returned from his broken collectors, humiliation only sharpened his hunger. He did not send more brutes. He sent a professional, a man called Silas Rook. Rook did not arrive with banners or threats. His presence slipped in like rot beneath floorboards. The warning signs were subtle at first. A dead raven left on the doorstep, its eyes torn out. The well water turning foul overnight. Strange marks carved into trees along the property's edge symbols Wade recognized from the darker, half-forgotten superstitions of war. Fear crept in slowly. The hills no longer felt quiet. Iris began glancing over her shoulder, hearing things that weren't there. Wade slept less, his hand rarely leaving the grip of the long knife he now wore at his belt. Rook's weapon was not force, it was dread. One evening, Iris found a small doll lying on the path to the barn. Finely made, dressed in noble fabric. Across its porcelain face was a crude red stain painted to mirror her own mark. She dropped it like it had burned her breath, snagging sharp in her chest. The message was unmistakable, personal, deliberate. The hunter knew where to cut, deepest. Wade Kestrel found her frozen there, color drained from her face. He took the doll from her without a word and fed it to the fire. The flames swallowed it fast, the porcelain blackening warping into something twisted. That same night, Silas Rook pressed closer. He went after the barn, hoping to torch Wade's horses his living. Wade was ready. What followed wasn't a clumsy brawl, but a tight, lethal exchange under moonlight. Steel flashed. Leather hissed. Their breaths came hard and low as knives whispered past bone. From the doorway, Iris Blackmore watched Hart hammering the polished jade button, clenched in her fist like a prayer. Wade had the power. Rook had speed and a sharper mind. He feinted towards the house, toward Iris, baiting Wade into reaching too far. The blade kissed Wade's side, shallow but clean. Then Wade turned the tide, ripping the knife away and driving Rook to the ground, pinning him there. Harlan Vane won't stop. Rook rasped blood on his teeth, a grin breaking through. And it's not just him you ought to fear. His eyes flicked toward Iris. I know who you are, Kestrel, the butcher of Black Ridge. Your own men whispered your name. Imagine what that little noble girl would think if she knew how many of her own people fell to your hand. The words hung cold and sharp. Wade's face set the brief edge of victory crumbling to ash. He released the hold. Rook laughed and slipped back into the dark like smoke. Wade turned to Iris, his expression hollowed. The poison had landed. They couldn't stay. The ranch was no longer shelter, it was a mark. Wade knew Rook wouldn't be the last. Vane would send more. Men. A whole force, if need be. They packed what they could carry, food blankets, Wade's weapons, and the jade button Iris now wore in a small pouch at her throat. Before dawn, they left, moving into the broken canyons along the barony's edge, where riders hesitated and pursuit thinned. The trail was punishing. Still, they weren't alone for long. On the second day, they found people huddled beneath a rock face, an old man and his wife, despair carved deep into their lines. Vane had taken their land too, dredging up an ancient debt they couldn't pay. They had nothing but the clothes they wore. Wade shared their food. Iris, seeing the woman shiver, wrapped her in one of their precious blankets. The next day brought another family, a young couple with a fevered child, cast out for failing to meet the Baron's crushing grain levy. Drawing on what her mother Eloan Price had taught her, Iris found herbs to ease the boy's heat. Without ceremony, the cast-off began to gather. All of them broken, all of them stripped by the same greed. They leaned on Wade for protection, his quiet strength a shield against fear. But they turned to Iris for something else. She took hold. Using the hard lessons learned in her father's Hall's skills she once despised, she measured rations, set watches, and guided the building of a hidden defensible camp deep inside a box canyon, laying the first bones of what would become Gravel Hollow. She spoke to those who had lost everything, her voice even and sure. She told them her own story, how she had been cast aside, and somehow that truth steadied them. The woman they had been taught to fear was not cursed. She endured. She led. The red mark on her face, once a brand of shame, became a banner of defiance. They no longer saw a flaw. They saw distinction, proof of survival, of strength. Wade Kestrel watched the change with quiet wonder. The timid girl, who had arrived from a palace of contempt, was gone. In her place stood a woman driven by fierce mercy and an unbending will. He had meant to shield her from the world. Instead, she was shaping a new one at its edge. The gathered kin grew into something more, a tight circle of resistance in open country. What the world had thrown away, bound by need and kindness, was becoming resilient and rare. The rise of a living settlement of cast-offs along his border was an insult Harlan Vane could not ignore. It wasn't a nuisance, it was a signal, one that might spread. He chose to end it. He raised his private force, 50 mounted men armed and ready, and sent them toward the canyons. At the same time, rumors seeped back to Mortimer Blackmore's court, not of a runaway daughter, but of a witch stirring rebellion on his western line, a woman bearing the same mark as his child. The tale shamed him. It stained his name. Fueled by rage and a grim curiosity to witness the outcome of his cruelty, he rode out with 20 of the Blackmore ward. Unaware of one another, both columns converged on the box canyon. Inside the camp, Wade and the people of Gravel Hollow prepared. They were no army, but the land favored them. They loosened stone shelves above the narrows, dug pits lined with sharpened stakes, and readied bows and slings, with the hard resolve of those who had nowhere left to go. Iris Blackmore moved among them, steadying frayed nerves by her presence alone. She sent women and children into the deepest caves and carried water to the guards at the rim. The Vane cutthroats arrived first, their confidence loud and careless. They charged the mouth of the canyon and met thunder. Rock tore loose, crushing the front ranks and sealing the passage. Panic rippled. From above, stones and arrows poured down as the outcasts fought with raw courage that made up for training they lacked. The fight tightened into a savage churn. Wade stood at its core, a blur of steel-long knife and seized sword flashing as one. He fought like a man defending more than breath, defending his very soul. As the cutthroats began to gather themselves, Mortimer Blackmore's riders appeared along the ridge. Taking the chaos below for open revolt, he raised his hand. "Charge," he ordered. "Leave none standing." The Blackmore ward plunged in, turning confusion into carnage. Trapped between defiant settlers and fresh armored guards, Vane's men faltered and broke. The canyon floor became a killing ground, air split by screams and ringing steel. In a brief, blood-slick lull, Mortimer drove his horse forward, hunting the leader. His gaze climbed the rock walls and found a figure on a high ledge directing the defense. A woman stood there. Mortimer Blackmore took in the dark sweep of her hair, the hard line of her jaw, and then she turned, and the crimson mark burned unmistakable on her cheek. Disgust curled his mouth. So he thundered, his voice ricocheting off stone. The cursed daughter crowns herself queen of beggars and thieves. I should have drowned you the day you were born. The words were meant to break her. They didn't. Iris Blackmore held his gaze steady and unbowed. She had lived inside his contempt all her life. It held no weight now. Below them the fighting thickened near the canyon mouth. One of Harlan Vane's lieutenants gathered a knot of men for a last reckless surge toward the caves where the families hid. Wade Kestrel saw it and felt ice clamp his chest. He had to warn her. He cut his way toward the ledge, shouting up through the din, his voice raw with urgency. He used the name he spoke only in the quiet hours, the name he'd learned from her murmured sleep, the name she herself had nearly forgotten. Iris left, their breaking through. At the sound of that name, Iris Mortimer froze. The sneer drained from his face. His grip whitened on the reins. And then it came to him, unbidden crushing. Elowen Price. Not his daughter's given name. Her mother's. His first wife, the woman he had loved beyond reason, the woman who died bringing their child into the world. In his grief, he had cast the infant away, convincing himself the birthmark was a curse that stole his love. He erased Elowen's name from the halls, hid her likeness, forbade her memory. He never told his daughter who her mother was. Now he stared at the woman on the ledge, the child he had discarded, and for the first time, he saw no curse. He saw Elowen's eyes, Elowen's defiance. Elowen's name spoken into life by a scarred foreign soldier in the heart of a blood-soaked canyon. The hatred he'd built for 20 years collapsed into dust. The battle roared on, but Mortimer stood empty, haunted on a field of his own making. His paralysis was signal enough. The Blackmore ward, seeing their lord stunned and silent, faltered. Caught between the outcasts' fury and fresh armored ranks, the Vane cutthroats broke and ran, scattering in chaos. Bloodied and spent, the people of Gravel Hollow stood amid the wreckage, disbelief, grief and hard-won triumph etched on their faces. Quiet, settled, broken only by the wounded. Wade climbed to Iris's side, checking her with careful hands, relief plain in his eyes. Below, Mortimer dismounted. He walked through the ruin like a sleepwalker, stopping at the base of the ledge. The man who looked up was old cruelty and pride, stripped away, leaving a hollow shell. Iris. He whispered the name, a confession. She looked down at him, not with hatred or triumph, but with a deep, weary calm. All her life, she had chased a scrap of his approval. Seeing it laid bare now, she found she no longer needed it. That was my mother's name, she said, her voice clear in the still air. You took it from me. You took everything Iris Blackmore said. But you don't get this. You don't get this land or these people. She gestured to the community already moving among the wounded, lifting, binding, rebuilding. We are what you cast aside, Father, and from the pieces we made a home. Mortimer Blackmore opened his mouth, apologies, forming excuses, a plea for forgiveness he had no right to ask. Iris raised her hand. He stopped. Go, she said. There was no venom in her voice, only certainty. Go back to your empty halls and your cold throne. Live with what you did. That will be your penance. Mortimer held her gaze for a long moment, seeing at last the sovereign she had become. He saw Elowen Price in her strength, felt the full weight of his loss. The daughter he had never known crashed down upon him. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, a broken man leaving the ruin he had tried to make. Iris watched him go. Then she turned to Wade Kestrel. She took his wounded hand in both of hers, her heart empty of vengeance and full of the future she would claim. The final page of her old life had been written in blood and battle. The first line of the next was already being set. 2 years passed. The box canyon that once sheltered desperation had become a living hidden settlement, named by its people for what it was. Barren ground tended by hands with nothing left to give proved generous. Terraced gardens climbed the rock. Smart channels carried water from a secret spring. Children laughed where screams once echoed. What began as cast-offs became a family bound by survival and by loyalty to the woman who taught them their worth and the soldier who kept them safe. Iris was no longer defined by the mark on her face, but by the clarity in her eyes and the mercy in her choices. She was their leader, their judge, their friend. Wade stood with her, his war finally behind him. The quiet he'd chased on a lonely ranch he found here in the heart of a community at her side. He was their guardian, their teacher, the steady strength beneath it all. One evening, as the sun laid long, gentle shadows through the canyon, Wade led Iris to a flat-topped mesa overlooking the settlement. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. He took her hand. In his palm was not the jade button he had once returned, but a simple ring carved from the dark wood of the house they'd been forced to leave. He had gone back for it, a pilgrimage to where their life together began. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't a lord's jewel. It was worth more. A circle from their first fire, their first shelter, their first peace. "You are my home," he said softly, emotion unhidden at last. She rested her head on his shoulder. Their hands entwined the wooden ring warm against her skin. Below them, lights flickered from gathered hearths, families leaning close, a life raised from cruelty's ashes. "No," she whispered, fullness in her voice. "We are home together." They stood in the twilight, two outcasts who found not only each other, but a world born of a cruel joke driven through violence and redeemed by a love stronger than any army, deeper than any scar. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal bara disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.